The mahogany mantel clock always chimed 4 minutes slow, its internal brass gears emitting a dry, scraping rattle before striking the half-hour. Beatrice sat in the high-backed armchair by the bay window, her wool-gloved fingers wrapped around a small, chipped ceramic mug of chamomile tea. The tea had gone lukewarm, a thin, pale skin forming over the amber liquid, but she did not rise to empty it. Instead, she watched the gray November fog cling to the glass pane, distorting the skeletal branches of the willow tree in the front garden. At her feet, Buster, an elderly terrier with a muzzle bleached white by age, let out a long, wheezing sigh. His tail gave a single, half-hearted thump against the worn Persian rug before he settled his chin back onto his paws. He was 12 years old, his hind legs stiff from arthritis, his breathing a steady, rhythmic rasp that had become the background hum of the small cottage. Today was the third Thursday of the month. Historically, this was the day the courier delivered the municipal pension statement, followed shortly by the automatic deposit clearing in her local bank account. It was a modest sum, $2,400 a month, earned through 34 years of quiet, clerical work at the county records office. Historically, it was also the day her son, David, and her daughter-in-law, Pamela, drove 30 miles from their suburban subdivision to check on her. Beatrice took a slow, silent breath. Her chest felt tight, not from illness, but from the sheer weight of the routine. She looked down at her black leather handbag hanging from the brass peg beside the front door. For 5 years, she had kept her bank book, her spare debit card, and her pension allocation letters in the zippered middle compartment of that bag. It was always there, hanging in plain sight, a convenient repository for when David offered to help run her errands, or when Pamela volunteered to sort through those dusty utility bills. Today the middle compartment was empty. At 9:15 a.m., while the kitchen kettle was still whispering on the stove, Beatrice had quietly removed the blue plastic bank book and the gray envelope containing her annual pension breakdown. She had not hidden them in the master bedroom or beneath the mattress, places David would inevitably look if he offered to retrieve her slippers. Instead, she had slipped them into the deep, fleece-lined inner pocket of her heavy winter coat, which hung in the back of the dark cellarway closet behind the old vacuum cleaner. It was a small, microscopic adjustment. To anyone else, it would look like forgetfulness. To Beatrice, it was the first, quiet repositioning of her boundaries. The low, wet crunch of tires on the gravel driveway broke the silence. Buster's ears twitched, but he did not rise. He let out a low, vibrating growl from the back of his throat, his dark eyes fixing on the front door with an old dog's deep, unshakable distrust. "Easy, boy," Beatrice murmured, her voice thin but steady, her hand reaching down to stroke the rough fur behind his ears. Through the fogged glass of the window, she watched the clean, silver bumper of David's late-model SUV slide into view. The engine died with a quiet, expensive purr. The driver's side door opened, and David stepped out, adjusting the collar of his designer wool coat. He was 42, his hair cut in a neat, professional taper, his face wearing that familiar, slightly strained mask of filial concern. From the passenger side, Pamela emerged. She was holding a bright pink cardboard box from the bakery downtown, the kind that held dry, over-sweetened glazed donuts Beatrice had repeatedly mentioned made her stomach sour. Pamela's expression was bright, her eyes already scanning the exterior of the cottage, noting the loose gutter on the east corner and the pile of damp leaves by the porch. The front door did not lock properly in the autumn damp. The strike plate was slightly misaligned, requiring one to lift the handle by half an inch before turning the key. David didn't knock. He turned the handle with a sharp, impatient twist, pushing the door open into the small hallway. "Mom?" David's voice boomed through the quiet house, carrying that loud, performative warmth he used whenever he crossed her threshold. "We're here! Look who we brought to see you!" Pamela stepped in behind him, her high heels clicking sharply against the yellowed linoleum of the entryway. The scent of her expensive, citrus-heavy perfume instantly cut through the stale smell of lemon wax and peppermint tea that Beatrice preferred. "Oh, Beatrice, darling," Pamela cooed, her voice pitched half an octave higher than normal. She hurried into the living room, setting the pink bakery box on the small coffee table with a soft cardboard clack. She leaned down, pressing her dry, powdered cheek against Beatrice's face. "You look so pale today. Doesn't she look pale, David? We were so worried about you with this damp weather. I told David, we have to go see your mother. She simply cannot be left alone in this drafty place." Beatrice sat perfectly still, her hands remaining wrapped around her lukewarm mug. She did not return the embrace, but she offered a small, polite curve of her lips, the exact degree of pleasantness required to avoid suspicion. "I am fine, Pamela," Beatrice said quietly. "The radiator is working well enough." "Is it?" David asked, walking over to the mantelpiece. His eyes did not linger on the old framed photograph of his late father. Instead, they drifted immediately to the small wicker basket where Beatrice usually kept the incoming mail. He reached out, his fingers casually shuffling through the 3 envelopes sitting inside, a water bill, a local grocery flyer, and a circular from the community center. "Seems a bit chilly in here, Mom. You really shouldn't be skimping on the heating. If you need help with the gas bill, you know you just have to say the word." He turned back to face her, his hands tucked into his trousers pockets, his thumb jingling his car keys. "We saw the mailman down the lane," David added, his tone conversational, though his eyes remained fixed on her face. "Did the pension statement come today? I know the county was supposed to adjust the cost of living allowance this quarter. I wanted to make sure they didn't shortchange you again." Beatrice watched the keys jingle in his pocket. Clink, clink, clink. Beside her chair, Buster gave another low, wet growl. Pamela immediately took a step back, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the old dog. "Really, Beatrice," Pamela murmured, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "That dog is getting so cantankerous. He shouldn't be growling at family. It's simply not safe." "He is just old, Pamela," Beatrice said. She took a slow sip of her cold tea, her eyes reflecting the pale gray light of the window. "He knows exactly who belongs in this room." The pink cardboard box sat between them on the low table, its lid slightly warped from the moisture in the air. Pamela reached out, her long manicured nails, painted a deep, glossy plum, clashing with the faded floral pattern of the coffee table's lace runner. She peeled back the tape securing the lid, a sharp tearing sound that made Buster's ears twitch once more. The smell of lard, artificial vanilla, and white sugar immediately bloomed into the small room. "They're fresh from the bakery on 4th, Pamela said, her face lighting up with a practiced brightness as she lifted a heavy, glistening ring of dough. "I told the girl behind the counter, my mother-in-law is very particular. Make sure they're the ones with the extra glaze. Here, Beatrice, let me get you a plate." "I have already eaten my toast, Pamela," Beatrice said, her voice remaining low, level, and entirely devoid of the warmth Pamela was projecting. "The doctor said the sugar is not good for my pressure." "Oh, a little treat won't hurt once a month," Pamela laughed, though the sound was hollow, terminating abruptly as she set the donut down on a small paper napkin she had brought in her purse. She wiped her fingertips with a slow, scraping motion, her eyes darting toward David. David had moved from the mantelpiece to the small hallway that led to the kitchen. His leather-soled shoes made a dull, heavy thump on the floorboards. To an outsider, he looked like a son making himself at home, but Beatrice knew the exact cadence of his movements. He walked to the counter where the bread box sat. He opened the pantry door, its rusty hinges giving a high, metallic squeak before closing it with a soft, deliberate click. He was looking for her medication bottles. Specifically, he was looking for the receipt stapled to the paper bag from the pharmacy, which would show exactly how much of her monthly cash had already been spent. "The kitchen looks a bit cluttered, Mom," David called out from the doorway, his voice carrying the faint, echoing quality of the empty tiled space. "You've got those old newspapers piled by the fridge again. You know that's a fire hazard. I can take them out to the bin for you while we're here." "The papers are from this week, David," Beatrice said to the window. "I read the local notices on Fridays." David stepped back into the living room. He had a small, white plastic bottle of heart medication in his hand, the blood pressure pills she took every morning. He turned the bottle over in his palm, his thumb scraping against the label. "This prescription was filled on the 10th, David said, his eyes narrowing slightly as he read the fine print. "The copay on this is usually $45. Did you use the debit card, or did you pay cash?"
"I used cash," Beatrice said.
"Cash?"
David's brow furrowed, his voice dropping into that familiar condescending register he reserved for when he believed she was mishandling her funds. He sat down on the edge of the matching armchair opposite her, his knees nearly touching hers in the narrow space. "Mom, we talked about this. When you use cash, we can't track your expenditures on the banking app. It makes it incredibly difficult for me to balance your monthly ledger. If there's a discrepancy, the bank won't help us."
Us. The words sat in the cold air between them like a physical object. For 2 years, David had insisted on having the mobile banking application installed on his own phone, claiming it was the only way to protect her from online scams and unauthorized withdrawals. He had the password. He had the security alerts directed to his device. Every time Beatrice spent $20 on groceries or $30 on coal, David's phone would vibrate in his pocket, followed within an hour by a phone call asking if she really needed the extra kindling or the brand name butter. "I like to have the paper receipts, David," Beatrice said. "The register at the pharmacy gives a printed slip." "The paper slips get lost, Beatrice," Pamela interjected, her tone dripping with a soft, patronizing pity. She leaned forward, her heavy gold bracelets clinking against each other like small coins. "And you know how easily things get misplaced in this house. Just last month you couldn't find your electric bill for 3 days. David was frantic trying to make sure the payment cleared before the late fee hit." Beatrice did not point out that she had known exactly where the electric bill was. It had been sitting on her desk, waiting for her Tuesday trip to the post office. She did not point out that David had found it by searching her desk drawers while she was in the garden. "I have the bills under control," Beatrice said quietly. David set the medication bottle down on the coffee table, right next to the pink bakery box. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his face coming into the pale yellow light of the floor lamp. "Look, Mom, the reason I'm asking is because the bank statement should have cleared by now," David said, his voice dropping to a low, reasonable whisper. "I checked the app on the drive over. The pension deposit went through at midnight, $2,400, just like always. But the available balance is showing as $1,900. Did you write a check this week? Or did you set up an automatic draft without telling me?" Beatrice looked down at her lukewarm tea. She had not written a check. She had not set up an automatic draft. But on Monday morning, she had walked the 3 blocks to the branch downtown, the old brick building with the heavy oak doors, where the tellers still knew her by her first name. She had stood at the counter and quietly requested a $500 withdrawal in cash. She had not placed the bills in her black leather handbag. She had tucked them into a small, plain white envelope, which was currently resting inside the lining of her winter coat, right next to her bank book. "I had some expenses, David," Beatrice said. "What kind of expenses, Mom?" David's voice lost a fraction of its patience, the sharp, demanding edge of his true character showing through the cracks of his filial concern. $500 is a lot of money for someone who doesn't leave the house. You don't buy clothes, the groceries are delivered. If you're giving money to those solicitors on the phone again— "I don't speak to solicitors, David," Beatrice said. "Then where did it go?" Pamela asked, her eyes wide, her expression a mask of soft, wounded confusion. "Beatrice, you know we only want to make sure you're safe. There are so many people out there who take advantage of elderly women living alone. If someone is pressuring you, you have to tell us. We're your family." Beatrice looked at Pamela's handbag, a pristine tan leather tote with a designer logo stamped in gold on the clasp. It was brand new. Beatrice had seen the exact same bag in the department store catalog last week. It cost $450. "The money is taken care of," Beatrice said. "That's not an answer, Mom," David said, his jaw tightening. He stood up, his height making the low-ceilinged room feel even smaller, more claustrophobic. "I'm going to walk down to the mailbox. If the printed statement is there, we'll sit down and go over the ledger properly. We need to find out where that $500 went before the mortgage draft on the house hits next week." He walked toward the hallway, his boots clicking on the floor. "I'll be right back," he muttered, his hand already reaching for the doorknob. Beatrice did not move. She listened to the lift and twist of the front door handle, followed by the heavy, damp rush of cold air that entered the house as the door opened and closed. The silence returned to the room, thick, cold, and entirely unbroken, save for the dry, paper-like rustle of Pamela's fingers adjusting her napkins. The grandfather clock in the corner of the room gave a dry, rhythmic tick that seemed to stretch the silence between Beatrice and her daughter-in-law. Pamela sat on the sofa, her posture rigid, her fingers tracing the edge of her plum-colored nails. She had not touched the donut she had set on the paper napkin. The glaze on the pastry had begun to sweat in the humid warmth of the room, turning a translucent, sticky yellow under the light of the floor lamp. "You know, Beatrice," Pamela said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial, low register that felt entirely artificial. "David is under an immense amount of pressure lately. The logistics firm— well, the shipping rates have been terrible this quarter. He's working 60 hours a week just to keep the overhead covered." Beatrice did not turn her head. Her eyes remained fixed on the gray mist pressuring the window pane. "A business requires a great deal of labor." "It does," Pamela sighed, leaning forward so that her gold chain necklace swung like a tiny, heavy pendulum over the coffee table. "And it's not just the business, it's the future. We have to think about what comes next, the kids' college funds, the house payments. It's a constant weight. David doesn't sleep. He sits at his desk until 2 in the morning going over spreadsheets." She paused, waiting for Beatrice to offer some word of comfort, or perhaps a familiar promise of financial support. When Beatrice remained silent, Pamela's smile returned, though it was tighter now, the corners of her mouth twitching slightly. "That's why we worry about this place so much," Pamela continued, her hand sweeping out to indicate the low-ceilinged living room, the faded wallpaper with its pattern of pale blue cornflowers and the worn wool rug. "A house this old, it's a liability. The roof will need $3,000 of work by spring. The foundation in the cellar is damp. If we were to look into one of those lovely senior living suites over in West Oak, well, the equity from selling this cottage would more than cover it. You'd have a heated pool, 3 meals a day, and no gutters to clean." Beatrice took a slow, deliberate sip of her lukewarm tea. The porcelain rim of the mug was cool against her lower lip. "Buster does not like the sound of indoor hallways," Beatrice said. "He would bark at the neighbors." Pamela's eyes flicked down to the old terrier. Buster was staring at her from the rug, his chin resting on his paws, but his dark eyes were wide and unblinking. "Well," Pamela said, her tone sharpening by a fraction of a decibel, "an animal is an animal, Beatrice. One has to prioritize human comfort eventually. It's simply not practical to keep a 3-bedroom house running for one person and a dog who can barely walk." The heavy, wet thump of boots on the front porch interrupted her. The door handle lifted and turned with a sharp metallic clatter. David stepped into the hallway, his face flushed red from the damp wind, his boots caked with yellow mud from the lane. He was holding 3 thin pieces of paper in his gloved hand. He did not take off his boots. He walked straight into the living room, leaving a wet, dark smear of clay on the entryway linoleum. "Nothing but junk," David muttered, tossing the papers onto the coffee table beside the pink donut box. The papers slid across the wood: a circular for a local carpet cleaning service, a political flyer with a faded color photograph of a smiling candidate, and a grocery store catalog. There was no white envelope from the bank. There was no printed pension statement. David stood over the coffee table, his chest rising and falling as he stared at the circulars. He pulled off his leather gloves one by one, the leather making a dry, sticking sound against his skin. "The statement should have been here by Tuesday, Mom," David said, his voice tight. "The bank always mails them on the 15th. I checked the delivery calendar." "Perhaps the mail is slow today, David," Beatrice said. "The mail isn't slow," David said, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at her. "The courier had 3 packages for the Millers down the lane. He's on time. Did you call the bank, Mom? Did you ask them to change something?" Beatrice set her mug down on the small wooden side table. She did not look at him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her fingers resting over the thick wool of her cardigan. "I do not like to call the bank, David," she said. "The automated menus are very confusing." "Then why isn't the statement here?" David demanded. He took a step closer, his shadow falling across her chair, blocking the pale yellow light from the floor lamp. "I need that printed ledger, Mom. If you've misplaced it, or if you had it redirected to some online portal, you've locked me out of the account details. The mobile app only shows the last 30 days, and it doesn't give the full transaction history without the statement code." Beatrice remained silent. She had not misplaced the statement. On Monday morning, after withdrawing the $500 in cash, she had sat at the desk of a young teller named Susan. Susan had a quiet voice and small, neat hands. Beatrice had requested that her account preferences be updated. She had canceled the paper mail delivery to the cottage. She had not opted for the online portal David had installed on his phone. Instead, she had registered a small, physical post office box at the brick station downtown, paid for 6 months in advance with a single $50 bill from her purse. She had directed the bank to mail all future paper statements, tax documents, and pension notices to that box, Box 114. Susan had stamped the confirmation slip with a purple ink seal and handed it to Beatrice. The slip was currently resting inside the zippered inner pocket of her winter coat, alongside the cash and the bank book. David would never find it in the mailbox at the end of the lane. "I will look for it tomorrow, David," Beatrice said, her voice remaining perfectly even, devoid of the defensiveness he was expecting. "The wind is very cold today. You should take off your boots before the mud dries on the rug." David stared at her, his jaw working as he tried to find a lever of guilt to pull. He looked at Pamela, who gave a small, helpless shrug from the sofa. "Fine," David said, his voice dropping into a low, resentful register. "We'll wait until next week. But we're going to sit down and find out where that $500 went, Mom. I mean it. We can't have you throwing money away when the house needs so much work. It's simply not responsible." He turned and walked back to the entryway, his mud-caked boots leaving a second trail of yellow stains across her clean floor. The kitchen of the cottage was always 3 degrees colder than the living room, its north-facing window shadowed by the high brick wall of the neighboring coal yard. Beatrice moved slowly into the kitchen, her wool-socked feet silent on the cold linoleum. She did not sit at the small oak table in the center of the room. Instead, she stood by the cast-iron stove, her hand resting on the cold kettle. Pamela had followed her, her plum-colored nails already hovering over the handle of the old wood-paneled refrigerator. "Let me look in here, Beatrice," Pamela said, her voice dropping into that light, bustling tone she used when she wanted to establish her domain over another woman's space. "You shouldn't be standing on your feet to prepare lunch. I'll just whip up a little something with whatever you have. A nice soup, perhaps?" She pulled the refrigerator door open. The old rubber gasket gave a sticky, tearing groan, and the low, rattling hum of the compressor kicked in, vibrating through the floorboards. Pamela did not immediately reach for the milk or the butter. Her eyes, sharp and systematic, swept the top shelf first. She lifted a half-empty jar of pickled beets, checked the underside of the lid, and set it down with a sharp clink. She moved a container of leftover broth, her fingers lingering on the space behind it, searching the dark rear corners of the shelf where an elderly person might tuck an envelope of cash. "Beatrice, darling," Pamela called out, her head still half inside the cold white light of the fridge. "You really have to watch the expiration dates on these things. This sour cream is 3 weeks past its prime. I'm just going to throw it in the bin for you." "The cream is fine, Pamela," Beatrice said, her voice flat. "I use it for the scones." "Well, it's simply not safe," Pamela murmured. She set the tub on the counter, her eyes already moving to the upper cupboards. She began opening them one by one, the wooden doors hitting the frames with a series of dull, hollow thuds. Clack, clack, clack. She reached into the back of the tea cupboard, lifting the heavy tin of Earl Grey. She shook it. Rattle. The sound was soft, the whisper of loose tea leaves against metal. Pamela's shoulders dropped slightly, a microscopic sign of disappointment, before she set the tin back and reached for the ceramic flour jar. She lifted the lid, her eyes scanning the white surface of the flour to see if any plastic-wrapped bundles had been buried beneath the surface. Beatrice watched her. She did not speak. She did not offer to help. She simply stood by the cold stove, her face a smooth, unreadable mask of patient observation. In the dining room, just beyond the kitchen archway, David sat at the oak table. He had not taken off his heavy wool coat. The blue-white glare of his smartphone screen washed over his face, carving deep, dark shadows beneath his eyes and highlighting the sharp, stubborn line of his jaw. His thumb was flicking upward on the screen with a rapid, aggressive cadence. "Mom," David called out, his voice tight with an irritation he was no longer trying to conceal. "The banking app is completely frozen on my screen now. It keeps asking for a secondary verification code sent via text, but when I hit send code, it says the mobile number on file has been updated. Did the bank change your settings on Monday?" Beatrice turned her gaze from Pamela's searching fingers to the archway. "The young lady at the counter said the security was being upgraded, David," Beatrice said, her tone mild and cooperative. "She said there were too many fraud cases in the county. She said she was putting an extra layer on the account to keep it safe." "An extra layer?" David's chair scraped violently against the floorboards as he stood up. He walked into the kitchen, holding the phone out toward her like an accusation. "Mom, she locked me out." The verification code is going to your phone now. I can't see the transactions. I can't see the pending drafts. How am I supposed to monitor your bills if I have to call you every time I want to log in? I have my phone in my knitting basket, David, Beatrice said. I can read the numbers to you when the bills arrive. That's not the point! David's voice rose, the performative warmth of the morning entirely gone now, replaced by the raw, cold authority of a man who felt his grip slipping. It's inefficient, it's unsafe. If you get one of those phishing texts and you read the code to some stranger, they'll empty your entire pension before we can even call the sheriff. I told you, I need to have direct, unhindered access to that portal. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her small, woolen-clad frame. We need to go down to the branch tomorrow, David said, his tone shifting from an executive command to a hard, low demand. I'll drive you. We'll sit down with the manager, and we'll put my name on the account as a joint owner. We talked about this last year, Mom. It's the only logical step. If something happens to you, if you have a stroke, or if you slip on the ice, I won't be able to pay the utility bills or handle the taxes without a mountain of probate paperwork. We need to do it now. Pamela stopped her search of the cupboards. She stood with her hand still resting on a box of baking soda, her head turned slightly, her eyes fixed on Beatrice, waiting for the reaction. Beatrice looked at her son's phone. The screen had gone dark, reflecting only the dim, gray outline of the kitchen window and the pale, tiny shape of her own face. My health is very good, David, Beatrice said quietly. The doctor said my heart is as strong as a woman 20 years younger. It's not about your heart, Mom, David said, his jaw tightening until the skin over his cheekbones went white. It's about logistics. It's about being responsible. I'm your son. I'm the one who handles this family's affairs. Now where is your ID? We should make sure you have your driver's license and your social security card ready for the morning. He reached out, his hand hovering near the pocket of her cardigan, as if he might search her himself if she did not comply. Beside the stove, the old dog Buster let out a sharp, sudden bark. The sound echoed loudly off the kitchen tiles, a cold, metallic warning that made David freeze, his hand dropping back to his side as the dog stood in the doorway, his white, muzzled jaw set, his dark eyes burning with a quiet, ancient rage. Beatrice did not look at her son's hand. She turned her head slowly, her gaze resting on the old terrier standing in the kitchen doorway. "Down, Buster," Beatrice said, her voice dropping into a soft, steady rhythm. "It is only David." The dog did not sit, but the sharp tension in his shoulders eased by a fraction of an inch. He let out a low, vibrating huff through his nostrils, his dark eyes never leaving David's leather-clad legs as he slowly sank onto his haunches, guarding the threshold. David took a step back, his phone screen finally going black in his hand. He rubbed his thumb against his temple, his chest rising in a long, shallow breath that smelled faintly of the citrus cologne Pamela had sprayed in the car. "I don't have time for this today, Mom," David said, his voice flat, stripped of the manicured patience he had worn when he first arrived. "I have a conference call with our regional distributor in 40 minutes. But we are going to the branch. First thing tomorrow morning. I'll be here at 9. Have your purse ready." "The roads will be very icy in the morning, David," Beatrice said, her hands remaining folded in her lap. "The radio said the freeze is coming from the north tonight." "I have 4-wheel drive, Mom," David said, his tone biting. "The ice isn't going to stop us. 9 o'clock. Don't go wandering down to the village before I get here." Pamela stepped away from the cupboards, her plum-colored nails sliding off the handle of the pantry. She smoothed the front of her expensive wool coat, her eyes lingering on the pink bakery box still sitting on the coffee table. The glaze on the donuts had fully dissolved now, turning into a thin, watery syrup that was beginning to soak through the paper napkin onto the lace runner beneath. "We'll leave you to your rest, Beatrice," Pamela said, her voice thin and sharp, the cooing affection from earlier completely gone. "I'll leave the donuts on the table. You really should try to eat one with your tea later. It's a shame to let them go to waste." She did not lean down to kiss Beatrice's cheek this time. She walked straight to the front door, her high heels clicking a rapid, angry beat on the linoleum. David followed her, his boots making a heavy, scraping sound as he dragged the remaining yellow clay across the entryway floor. He did not look back as he pulled the door open, letting in a sudden, freezing gust of damp wind that made the lace curtains in the living room billow like small gray sails. The lift and twist handle clattered shut. The heavy metallic rumble of the SUV's engine started up in the driveway, followed by the wet crunch of gravel as they backed out of the gate. Beatrice sat perfectly still in her high-backed chair, watching the red glow of their taillights fade slowly into the thick, creeping fog at the end of the lane. When the sound of the car had completely died away, the silence of the cottage returned, filling the corners of the room like a physical presence. Beatrice stood up. Her knees gave a dry, muffled click, but she did not grimace. She walked into the entryway, retrieved the small straw broom from behind the umbrella stand, and began to sweep. Her movements were slow, rhythmic, and precise. She swept the dried flakes of yellow clay David had left behind into a small, neat pile, then brushed them into the dustpan with a single, practiced stroke. She walked to the kitchen and emptied the dustpan into the metal bin beneath the sink. "Come, Buster," she murmured. The dog limped into the kitchen, his tail giving 2 slow, heavy thumps against the cabinet doors. Beatrice reached into the pantry and pulled out his metal dish. She measured exactly 1 cup of his dry senior formula kibble, then added 3 tablespoons of warm water from the kettle, stirring it with an old metal spoon until the gravy thickened. She set the bowl on the floor. Buster began to eat, the dry, rhythmic sound of his chewing filling the quiet kitchen. While the dog ate, Beatrice walked to the dark cellarway door. She opened it, the cool, earthy scent of damp stone and wintering potatoes rising to meet her. She reached into the back of the closet, her fingers finding the heavy, rough wool of her winter coat. She slipped her hand into the deep, inner, zippered pocket. Her fingertips brushed the smooth plastic cover of her bank book. Beside it, the plain white envelope containing the $500 in cash was crisp and thick. And beneath that lay the small brass key to box 114, its metal edges cool against her skin. She did not pull them out. She simply held them for a moment in the dark, verifying their physical presence before zipping the pocket shut. Tomorrow, David would arrive at 9 o'clock. He would park his silver SUV in her driveway, blow his horn, and wait for her to come out with her purse. But Beatrice would not be there. The local bus, the blue and white county transit line that ran once a day through the village, stopped at the stone shelter near the church at exactly 7:45 a.m. She would take her heavy winter coat, she would take Buster, and she would not go to the bank downtown. She would go to the brick building on the outer edge of West Oak, the one with the large green sign that read, County Humane Society and Animal Rescue. She closed the cellar door, the latch clicking home with a quiet, final snap. The cold inside the cottage at 5:45 on Friday morning was a sharp, physical presence. Beatrice sat on the edge of her mattress, her feet immediately searching for the thick wool socks she had left draped over the footboard the night before. She did not switch on the overhead light. The sky outside was still a deep, bruised charcoal, the first pale gray line of dawn barely showing above the frozen ridges of the coal yard wall. She dressed in the dimness, her movements quiet and practiced. She wore her dark green corduroy trousers, a thick thermal undershirt, and her heaviest gray cardigan. Finally, she took down the rough, dark green winter coat from the cellarway door. She slid her arms into the sleeves, the heavy wool instantly wrapping her in a dull, reassuring weight. Her hand went instinctively to the inner zippered pocket, her fingertips verifying the cold, hard edges of her brass key to box 114, the crisp white envelope of cash, and the blue plastic bankbook. "Buster," she whispered into the dark hallway. A soft rustle came from the living room, followed by the slow, uneven click-clack of his nails on the linoleum. The dog stopped at her feet, his tail giving a single, tentative wag. He did not let out his usual morning yawn. He seemed to understand the quiet, tense air of the house. Beatrice reached into her knitting basket and pulled out his old, worn red canvas leash. The brass clip was cold and slightly rusted, requiring a firm squeeze of her thumb to open. It fastened onto his collar with a sharp metallic clink. In her small canvas tote bag, she placed a plastic bottle of tap water, a small collapsible rubber bowl, 3 dry biscuits for Buster, and her black leather coin purse. She checked the coin purse, $3 bills and 50 cents in silver, the exact fare for the county transit bus. She walked through the cold kitchen. On the dining table, the pink box of donuts sat exactly where Pamela had left it. The cardboard had absorbed the moisture from the air, the bottom of the box sagging and damp, smelling faintly of stale sugar and wet paper. Beatrice did not look at it. She walked to the front door. She did not turn on the porch light. She lifted the brass handle by exactly half an inch, turned the heavy key in the deadbolt until it clicked, and stepped out onto the porch. She pulled the door shut behind her, testing the handle twice to ensure the lock had caught. The morning air was freezing, hovering at 28 degrees. A thick, white crust of hoarfrost covered the dead hydrangea bushes and the gravel path, making the ground look as though it had been dusted with salt. The fog was dense, hanging low over the lane like a damp, heavy sheet, swallowing the shapes of the neighboring cottages. "Come, Buster," she murmured, keeping her voice low so it would not carry through the quiet morning. They walked down the driveway, Buster's stiff legs moving with a slow, careful cadence. Every few yards, he stopped to sniff the frozen grass at the edge of the ditch, his breath leaving his nostrils in tiny, rapid plumes of white steam. Beatrice adjusted her pace to match his, her gloved hand holding the leash loosely. The village church was 3/4 of a mile down the lane. The road was completely empty, the asphalt black and slick with patches of black ice. The only sound was the rhythmic, dry crunch of their boots and paws on the frozen dirt. Beatrice kept her head bowed against the biting wind, her scarf pulled up over her chin, her eyes fixed on the dim yellow glow of the single street lamp near the parish hall. It took them 20 minutes to reach the stone bus shelter. The shelter was a small 3-sided structure built of local limestone in the 1930s, its cedar shingle roof green with damp moss. Inside, the air smelled of wet stone, pine needles, and stale cigarette smoke. Beatrice sat down on the narrow wooden bench, pulling Buster close to her knees. She wrapped the hem of her heavy coat around his shoulders, feeling the tiny rhythmic tremors of his old body against her shins. She looked at her watch, the old silver-plated wind-up watch her husband had given her for their 20th anniversary. It was 7:38 a.m. In 22 minutes, David would be waking up in his warm suburban home. He would pour himself a cup of coffee from his expensive machine, adjust his tie, and prepare to drive to her cottage. He would expect to find her sitting in her armchair, her purse in her lap, her face pale and compliant, ready to be driven to the bank to sign away her independence. He would find only a dark, cold house, a locked door, and a box of melting donuts. At 7:45 a.m. precisely, the low, heavy drone of a diesel engine echoed through the fog. Two pale yellow headlights cut through the white gloom, reflecting off the damp stone of the church gate. The blue and white county transit bus rumbled to a halt by the curb, its air brakes letting out a loud, hissing sigh that made Buster lift his head. The pneumatic doors folded open with a soft rush of warm, vinyl-scented air. Beatrice stood up, took a firm grip of Buster's leash, and stepped up onto the high rubber stairs, her coins already resting in her gloved palm. The county transit bus hummed with a low hydraulic vibration that warmed the vinyl floorboards beneath Beatrice's boots. The heater under her seat hissed, blowing a steady draft of warm, dry air that smelled of old rubber and diesel exhaust over her ankles. Aside from an elderly man in a grease-stained mechanic's jacket asleep 3 rows ahead, the bus was empty. Beatrice sat near the back, her arm draped loosely over her canvas tote bag. Buster lay curled between her feet, his chin resting flat on the toe of her left boot, his dark eyes occasionally blinking as the gray winter-stripped trees of the county lane rolled past the foggy window. The landscape shifted slowly, the narrow lanes of the village giving way to the wider asphalt of the state highway, lined with shuttered farm stands and gravel yards. At 8:25 a.m., the driver pulled the bus to a squealing halt at the gravel turnout near the West Oak municipal boundary. "Here you go, ma'am," the driver called out, his voice echoing in the empty bus. "End of the line for this run." "Thank you," Beatrice said. She stood up, her joints protesting the sudden movement with a dull, familiar ache, and guided Buster down the steep rubber steps into the biting air. The County Humane Society and Animal Rescue sat 50 yards back from the highway, surrounded by a high, silver chain-link fence. It was a low, single-story building constructed of brown, split-face block, its gravel parking lot empty save for a rusted white utility van parked near the side door. The air here was clear and cold, smelling of damp pine needles from the state forest behind the property, mingled with the faint, sharp scent of commercial bleach. From the rear of the building, a muffled, rhythmic chorus of barks rose and fell, a hollow, echoing sound that made Buster's tail give a single, curious twitch. Beatrice walked up the concrete ramp to the double glass doors. A hand-lettered sign taped to the glass read, "Adoptions and Donations, Tuesday to Saturday, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. For emergency surrenders or administrative inquiries, please ring bell." Beatrice reached out and pressed the small black button beside the frame. Deep inside the building, a dull, two-tone chime rang. After a long moment, the lock clicked and one of the heavy doors swung open. A woman in her early 50s, wearing a green fleece vest over scrub trousers, looked out. Her gray-streaked hair was tied back in a messy bun, and a smudge of blue ink marked the side of her thumb. She looked tired, but her expression softened as her eyes fell on the old terrier sitting quietly at Beatrice's side. "Hello," the woman said, her voice raspy but gentle. "We don't officially open for adoptions until 10, but is everything all right? Are you here for a surrender?" "No," Beatrice said, her voice clear and steady in the crisp morning air. "I am not here to surrender, Buster. I am here to make an inquiry regarding a private estate planning matter. My name is Beatrice Vance." The woman blinked, a look of mild surprise passing over her face before she stepped back, holding the door open. "Oh, I see. I'm Martha, the shelter director. Please come inside out of the cold." The reception lobby was small and clean, smelling strongly of pine disinfectant and dry dog food. A low counter of light-colored laminate divided the room, behind which sat a metal desk piled with paper folders and donation canisters. In the corner, a large gray cat slept soundly inside a wicker basket under the warm glow of a desk lamp. Beatrice sat down on one of the plastic chairs by the wall, Buster immediately settling himself at her feet. She unzipped her heavy green winter coat, her fingers reaching into the inner pocket. "Martha," Beatrice said, pulling out the plain white envelope of cash. She did not open it yet. She laid it flat on her knee, her palm resting over the paper. "I have lived in this county my entire life. I have watched the way the municipal board handles the local funds, and I have watched the way the shelters are always left to scramble for private donations." Martha sat behind the counter, her hands folding over her desk blotter. "That is the truth, Mrs. Vance. We rely entirely on community support to keep the heating running in the kennels through the winter. This month has been particularly tight." "I have a modest pension," Beatrice continued, her voice level, devoid of any self-pity or theatrical display. "And I own my cottage on Oak Lane. It is fully paid for. The equity is valued at approximately $220,000. She paused, the grandfather clock in her own living room flashing briefly through her mind. But here, the only sound was the soft, rhythmic purring of the gray cat in the corner. "I wish to make 2 arrangements today," Beatrice said. "First, I would like to make an immediate, anonymous cash donation of $200 toward your winter heating fund." She opened the white envelope, slid 2 crisp $100 bills from the stack, and laid them on the laminate counter. "And second," Beatrice said, her eyes meeting Martha's with an absolute, unyielding clarity, "I would like to request the official forms for a primary charitable bequest. I intend to update my will to leave my home, my land, and the remainder of my liquid assets directly to this facility upon my passing. But there is a condition." Martha stared at the $200 bills on the counter, then looked at Beatrice, her expression shifting from professional fatigue to a deep, stunned quiet. "A condition?" Martha asked softly. "Yes," Beatrice said, her hand reaching down to touch the rough fur of Buster's back. "I require a formal, legally binding covenant. In the event of my passing, this shelter must assume immediate, lifetime custody and care of Buster. He must never be put up for general adoption. He must live his remaining days here, under your direct supervision, with all medical and dietary needs covered by the estate's trust." Martha looked down at the old dog. Buster lifted his head, his white-muzzled jaw parted in a soft, silent pant, his dark eyes calm and trustful. "We have a lifetime sanctuary program for cases exactly like this, Mrs. Vance," Martha said, her voice carrying a sudden, deep warmth. "It is rarely funded so generously, but yes, we can absolutely draft that covenant for you. I have the standard legal templates in my office." "Thank you," Beatrice said. "Please bring the paperwork. I have my identification and my bank details ready." As Martha stood up to walk into the back office, Beatrice's phone gave a sudden, long vibration inside her cardigan pocket. It was 9:02 a.m. David had arrived at the cottage. The phone inside Beatrice's cardigan pocket did not ring. She had set the ringer to silent 3 months ago, preferring the quiet, dull pulse of the vibration against her thigh to the shrill, electronic chime that always made Buster startle. Buzz, buzz, buzz. The vibration was long, steady, and persistent. It stopped for exactly 4 seconds, the silence rushing back into the small reception lobby, before the motor inside the plastic casing began to hum again. Buzz, buzz, buzz. Beatrice did not reach into her pocket. She kept her hands resting flat on her knees, her fingers still warm from the wool of her heavy coat. She looked at the laminate counter, where the 2 green $100 bills sat side by side, next to the sleeping gray cat. The cat's side rose and fell in a deep, slow rhythm, entirely undisturbed by the silent tension in the room. Martha returned from the back office, carrying a blue manila folder that was slightly frayed at the edges. She set it on the counter, opening it to reveal 3 neat, typewritten sheets of paper. "This is our standard lifetime sanctuary covenant, Mrs. Vance," Martha said, her voice dropping into a quiet, respectful register as she slid the pages toward Beatrice. "It was drafted by one of our trustees, Arthur Sterling. He's a retired trust attorney here in West Oak. It details the care, the veterinary provisions, and the restricted funding mechanism. If the estate leaves the property to us, a portion of the liquidation proceeds is automatically directed into an endowment specifically for Buster's maintenance." Beatrice reached into her bag and retrieved her reading glasses, an old wire-rimmed pair she kept in a hard leather case. She slid them onto her nose, the cool metal of the bridge settling against her skin. Buzz, buzz, buzz. The pocket of her cardigan grew still. A second later, a short, double pulse vibrated through the fabric. A text message. Beatrice slowly turned the first page of the document. The text was clear, written in a formal legalese print that she found comforting. It was a language of absolute boundaries. Section 3.2 specified that the animal would be housed in the administrative wing, with access to the outdoor exercise yard, and would be under the direct care of the shelter manager. "Mr. Sterling is very thorough," Beatrice said, her voice steady. "He is," Martha agreed, leaning against the desk. "He's been helping us manage our bequests for 12 years. He always says that a person's final wishes shouldn't be left to the discretion of people who didn't know them." Beatrice picked up the cheap blue ballpoint pen Martha had left on the blotter. The plastic was cool, the ink flowing cleanly as she wrote her full name, Beatrice Eleanor Vance, on the preliminary inquiry line at the bottom of the page. Her phone vibrated again. 2 short pulses, another text. She laid the pen down precisely in the groove of the desk calendar. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the small black smartphone, and pressed the lock button. The screen illuminated her face with a pale, cold light. There were 3 missed calls from David. Beneath them, 2 text messages from his number were displayed on the lock screen. David, 9:02 a.m. "Mom, the door is locked. I'm standing on the porch. Your walking boots are gone. Buster's red leash isn't on the hook. Where are you? We have to be at the bank by 10 o'clock. David, 9:06 a.m. "Mom, answer the phone. I see the donuts on the table through the kitchen window. Did you walk down to the post office? I'm driving down the lane to look for you. Answer me." Beatrice stared at the words for 3 seconds. Her face remained entirely blank, her breathing deep and even. She did not open the messaging application to reply. She did not slide her thumb to call him back. She pressed the power button on the side of the phone, turning the screen dark, and placed the device face down on the laminate counter next to the blue folder. "Martha," Beatrice said, adjusting her glasses, "I will need to meet with Mr. Sterling to formalize the deed transfer and update the will. I want to ensure the document is executed cleanly, with no room for probate disputes." "Of course," Martha said, her eyes shifting briefly to the dark screen of the phone on the counter before returning to Beatrice's face. "I can call Arthur right now. His office is just 3 blocks from here, next to the old courthouse. He's usually in on Friday mornings." "That would be very convenient," Beatrice said. She reached down, her gloved fingers gently tracing the contour of Buster's soft, velvety ear. The dog looked up at her, his dark eyes clear and calm, reflecting the soft yellow light of the desk lamp. He gave a tiny, silent yawn, his tail brushing once against her boot. They had 45 minutes before the bank downtown opened its heavy oak doors. By then, David would be standing in the lobby, his phone in his hand, his collar tight, his anger mounting as the branch manager looked at the clock and realized the elderly woman with the $200,000 estate was not coming to sign the papers. Beatrice folded her hands over the blue manila folder, the silence of the room wrapping around her like a shield. The plastic buttons of the desk landline clicked sharply as Martha dialed, the sound echoing in the clean, silent lobby. "Arthur?" "Yes, it's Martha down at the shelter," she said, her voice dropping into a warm, familiar rhythm. "I have a resident here with me, a Mrs. Beatrice Vance from Oak Lane. She's looking to draft a primary charitable bequest for her estate, along with a lifetime sanctuary covenant for her terrier." "Yes, he's here, a very sweet, quiet boy." "Excellent. We'll send her right over." Martha replaced the receiver with a soft, heavy clack. She looked up at Beatrice, offering a reassuring nod. "Arthur is in," Martha said. "He's just finishing his morning files, but he's cleared his desk for the next hour. His office is at 112 Court Street. It's a red brick building with green trim, right next to the historic probate courthouse. You can't miss the gold lettering on the window." "Thank you, Martha," Beatrice said. She stood up slowly, her fingers buttoning the top toggle of her heavy green coat, securing the thick wool scarf around her neck. She picked up her canvas bag, checking the zipper of the inner pocket to ensure the white envelope, her ID, and the brass key to box 114 were snug. The black smartphone remained in her pocket, dark and completely silent. She took a firm grip of Buster's red canvas leash. The old dog rose to his feet with a quiet grunt, shaking his coat once before falling into step beside her left heel. "We'll have the preliminary sanctuary files ready for Mr. Sterling's office by this afternoon," Martha said, walking them to the double-glass doors. "Keep warm, Mrs. Vance." "I will," Beatrice said. The cold outside was still biting, but the heavy fog had begun to thin, lifting into a high silver canopy of cloud that let a pale, watery winter light filter down onto the streets of West Oak. The town was quiet, the wide concrete sidewalks dusted with a thin layer of sand to prevent slipping. Beatrice walked at a measured, unhurried pace. Buster's paws made a soft, rhythmic pad, pad, pad beside the heavier, hollow thud of her winter boots. They passed a small bakery, the warm, rich scent of browning yeast and hot butter drifting out from the exhaust vent, followed by the dry, metallic smell of iron from the hardware store on the corner. At the end of the second block, the brick dome of the old county courthouse came into view, its copper roof oxidized to a pale, powdery green. Directly opposite the courthouse lawn sat 112 Court Street. It was a narrow, two-story townhouse built of dark red brick, its tall sash windows framed by dark green wooden shutters. On the main window, painted in neat gold leaf letters that caught the thin morning light, were the words, "Arthur Sterling, Attorney at Law, Trusts, Wills, and Estates." Beatrice walked up the 3 shallow stone steps, her hand wrapping around the heavy, cold brass latch of the door. She pushed it open. A small brass bell above the frame chimed with a clear metallic ring. The interior of the office was warm, smelling of aged paper, leather-bound books, and a faint, sweet trace of cherry pipe tobacco. The floorboards were covered in a thick, deep green wool carpet that swallowed the sound of their entry entirely. A tall, silver-haired man in his late 60s rose from behind a massive mahogany desk in the corner. He wore a tweed jacket with leather elbow patches and wire-rimmed reading glasses that sat low on his nose. "Mrs. Vance," the man said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that carried a calm, professional weight. "I'm Arthur Sterling." Martha called ahead. He walked around the desk, extending a hand. His grip was firm, dry, and warm. He looked down at Buster, who had immediately sat near Beatrice's boots, his white, muzzled face turned up, with a quiet curiosity. "And this must be the famous Buster," Mr. Sterling said. A small, genuine smile touched the corner of his mouth. "He looks like a very dignified gentleman." "He is," Beatrice said, releasing his hand. "He does not care for loud noises or hasty movements." "A wise policy," Mr. Sterling murmured, gesturing toward two deep, leather-bound armchairs positioned near a small, black iron hearth in the corner. A small blue gas flame flickered behind the grate, casting a gentle, radiating warmth across the room. "Please, sit. Let's get you out of that heavy coat, and we can discuss the details of your estate." Beatrice walked to the chair, her knees grateful for the soft, deep leather as she sank into the seat. Buster immediately curled himself onto the thick rug near her feet, his body absorbing the heat from the hearth with a slow, contented sigh. As Beatrice unbuttoned her green wool coat, her fingers brushed the plastic casing of her phone in her pocket. It was 9:35 a.m. In 25 minutes, the main branch of the County First Bank downtown would open. David would be pacing the marble floor of the lobby, his fingers drumming against his leather briefcase, his eyes darting to the heavy glass doors every time a customer walked in. He would be checking his watch, redialing her number, his irritation turning into a cold, desperate panic as the minutes ticked away. But here, in the quiet warmth of the attorney's office, the only sound was the gentle hiss of the gas fire and the dry, crisp rattle of a clean legal pad being turned over on the desk. The leather of the armchair was thick and cool where Beatrice's shoulders did not touch it, but the warmth from the small gas hearth quickly filled the space between her boots and the rug. Arthur Sterling sat back in his swivel chair, the wooden frame giving a soft, oiled creak as he leaned his head against the high headrest. He picked up a long, yellow legal pad, his hand reaching for a heavy black fountain pen that lay in a silver tray on his desk. He uncapped it with a slow, deliberate twist of his wrist, the brass threads clicking softly. "Martha mentioned the cottage on Oak Lane," Mr. Sterling said, his eyes scanning Beatrice over the rim of his reading glasses. "The deed is currently in your name alone, I assume?" "It is," Beatrice said. She reached into her canvas bag, her fingers sliding into the inner pocket of her green coat. She pulled out the folded, blue-covered deed, the original parchment from 40 years ago, its edges slightly yellowed and smelling of dry cedar. She laid it flat on the desk, smoothing the creases with her palm. "My husband, Thomas, passed 7 years ago. The probate was settled, and the title was transferred to me without encumbrance." Mr. Sterling pulled the deed toward him. He turned the pages with a slow, dry rustle, his pen poised over the yellow pad. "The legal description is clean," he murmured, writing a quick line of script in a neat, microscopic hand. "And the financial assets? You mentioned a municipal pension." "The pension is deposited into my checking account at County First Bank on the third Thursday of every month," Beatrice said. She placed her blue plastic bankbook on top of the deed. "The balance is currently $4,800 after my recent withdrawal. I also have a small savings certificate of $12,000, which matures in January." Mr. Sterling stopped writing. He set his pen down in the silver tray, the metal clinking softly. He folded his hands over his vest, his expression turning grave but entirely respectful. "Mrs. Vance, under the standard guidelines of estate distribution in this county, a primary residence and remaining liquid funds are typically left to the next of kin," he said, his voice dropping into a low, measured baritone. "Martha's notes indicate you have a son, David." "I do," Beatrice said. "And is there a specific reason you wish to bypass him entirely in favor of the Humane Society?" Mr. Sterling asked. He did not sound accusatory. He spoke with the quiet, clinical detachment of an attorney who had seen hundreds of families dissolve over a shared fence line or a forgotten safe deposit box. In this state, disinheriting an adult child is entirely legal, but it is also the most common ground for a probate contest. If your son believes you were under undue influence or that you lacked testamentary capacity when you signed these documents, he can file a caveat. The litigation could tie up the estate's assets for years, leaving Buster's care in a state of limbo. Beatrice looked down at the hearth. The blue gas flame flickered behind the iron grate, casting a soft, dancing shadow across Buster's white-muzzled face. The dog's ribcage rose and fell in a deep, rhythmic sigh, completely at peace in the warm room. "My son is a businessman, Mr. Sterling," Beatrice said, her voice quiet, steady, and entirely devoid of anger. "He drives an expensive car, and his wife wears expensive jewelry, but they are living on a margin of debt that I find frightening. For 3 years, they have visited me on the 3rd Thursday of every month. They do not come to prune the willow tree or to check if I have enough coal for the winter. They come to check the bank book. They come to see how much of my pension is left." She paused, her fingers smoothing the fabric of her gray trousers. "Yesterday," she continued, "my daughter-in-law spent 20 minutes searching my kitchen cupboards for my cash envelopes under the guise of preparing soup. My son demanded that I hand over my identification so he could add his name as a joint owner of my account today. He told me it was for my own safety, but I know what would happen if his name were on that ledger. Within 6 months, the cottage would be mortgaged to pay for his logistics firm's shipping debts. Within a year, I would be placed in a state-run facility, and Buster would be taken to the county pound to be put down because he is too old to be adopted." Arthur Sterling listened, his head tilted slightly, his eyes never leaving her face. He did not interrupt. He did not offer any trite words of comfort. He simply took a deep, slow breath, his hand reaching back for the black fountain pen. "I understand," he said softly. He turned to a fresh page on his yellow pad. "To ensure this will is completely contest-proof," Mr. Sterling said, the pen beginning to scratch across the paper with a dry, rhythmic hiss. "We will not simply omit David from the document. That is a common mistake. If you omit him, his lawyers can argue it was an oversight. Instead, we will draft a specific, explicit disinheritance clause. We will name him directly. We will state that you have made no provision for him, not out of lack of affection, but because you have already provided for him during your lifetime, and that your remaining assets are to be dedicated solely to the charitable trust." He looked up, his eyes sharp behind his glasses. "And we will have you evaluated by your primary physician, Dr. Evans, on the morning of the signing," he added. "He will sign an affidavit confirming your perfect mental clarity. When David's lawyers see that affidavit attached to the will, they won't even file the contest. They'll know they've lost before they start." At that exact moment, the grandfather clock on the wall of Mr. Sterling's office began to chime. Dong, dong, dong. 10 heavy, brass strokes echoed through the quiet room, signaling the hour. Beatrice felt a single, dull vibration in her cardigan pocket. A brief, muted pulse from her phone. It was exactly 10 o'clock. In the marble lobby of the County First Bank downtown, the heavy oak doors had just swung open. David would be standing by the velvet ropes, his face flushed, his eyes fixed on the entrance as the security guard turned the sign from closed to open. He would be clutching his leather folder, his phone pressed to his ear, listening to the dry, mechanical voice telling him that the subscriber he was trying to reach was currently unavailable. Beatrice did not look at her pocket. She picked up the blue-covered deed and handed it to Mr. Sterling, her face as calm and unbothered as the winter sky outside. "Let us begin the drafting, Mr. Sterling," she said. Arthur Sterling leaned closer to his desk, his fountain pen tracing a neat, horizontal line on the yellow legal pad. Schedule A of the covenant will deal specifically with Buster's daily maintenance, Mr. Sterling said, his eyes scanning the notes he had already taken. To make this legally binding upon the Humane Society, we must define his standard of care with absolute precision. What are his current medical and dietary requirements, Mrs. Vance? Beatrice took a slow, deep breath, her mind conjuring the small, daily routines that had defined her mornings for the past 5 years. He takes half of a carprofen tablet every morning at 7 with his food, Beatrice said, her voice dropping into a soft, steady cadence. It is for the stiffness in his hips. If he does not have it, he struggles to stand on the linoleum. He requires a orthopedic foam bed, quite low to the floor, as he can no longer jump. And he must have rugs placed over any bare wood or tile. His paws slip, and the sliding causes him pain. Mr. Sterling's pen scratched across the paper, the rhythmic scritch, scratch, the only sound in the warm room. Carprofen, joint support, orthopedic bedding, non-slip flooring. I have noted them all. What about his diet? 1 cup of senior kibble, mixed with exactly 3 tablespoons of warm water to soften it, Beatrice said. Twice a day, once at 7 in the morning and once at 5 in the evening. He does not care for canned food. It makes his stomach sour. Excellent, Mr. Sterling murmured, capping his pen with a soft metallic click. This schedule will be appended to both the will and the lifetime sanctuary covenant. The shelter will be legally required to maintain these exact standards, monitored by an independent executor. If they fail to do so, the remaining trust funds will automatically revert to a secondary animal charity of your choosing. That is very reassuring, Beatrice said. Mr. Sterling slid the yellow pad into his drawer, his hand reaching for a small white receipt book. My fee for the initial consultation and the drafting of these preliminary documents is $150, Mrs. Vance. We will settle the remainder of the legal costs once the final deed transfer and the will are executed next week. Beatrice reached into her canvas bag, her fingers finding the heavy, dark green wool of her coat pocket. She opened the plain white envelope, her thumb sliding over the remaining crisp $100 bills. She pulled out $100 bill and a $50 bill, laying them flat on the dark wood of the desk. No check, no credit card, Beatrice said quietly. I prefer to settle my debts in cash. Mr. Sterling took the bills, his fingers dry and precise as he counted them. He did not look surprised. He had practiced law in this county long enough to know that the older generation still carried their lives in their pockets. He wrote out a receipt on the carbon paper, tore the white copy from the pad with a sharp paper hiss, and handed it to her. Next Friday, Mr. Sterling said, standing up to walk her to the door. At 10:30, we will meet at Dr. Evans' clinic. First for your mental competency evaluation, and then we will come back here to sign the final papers in the presence of 2 witnesses. I will have the entire package ready. Thank you, Mr. Sterling, Beatrice said. She buttoned her coat, gathered her canvas bag, and took Buster's red leash. The old dog rose with a quiet, grunting stretch, his tail giving a single, heavy brush against the green wool carpet before they stepped back out into the cool, silver-gray light of Court Street. The town of West Oak was beginning to wake up, the dry crunch of gravel and the low hum of delivery trucks echoing off the brick storefronts. Beatrice walked 1 block north, her boots making a steady, rhythmic thud on the concrete, before stopping in front of the Bluebird Diner. The diner was a narrow, chrome-paneled building from the 1950s, its windows fogged over from the heat inside. Beatrice pushed the heavy glass door open, instantly wrapped in the warm, rich scent of frying onions, roasted coffee, and maple syrup. A waitress in a faded blue apron pointed toward a small booth in the back corner, far from the busy counter. "Just you today, Beatrice?" the waitress asked, her voice carrying a friendly local rasp. "Yes, Mary," Beatrice said, "just me." She slid into the vinyl booth, her knees settling beneath the low table. Buster crawled quietly under the bench, his body curling into a tight, warm ball against the metal heating vent that ran along the wall. He was completely out of sight, a silent, invisible companion. "I'll have a cup of black tea, please," Beatrice said, "and a toasted cheese sandwich on wheat, no butter on the outside, if you please." "Coming right up," Mary said, pocketing her pad. When the waitress had gone, Beatrice reached into her green coat pocket and pulled out her black phone. She set it flat on the laminate table, the screen dark and unbothered. She pressed the power button. The screen illuminated, the pale blue light reflecting off her reading glasses. There were now 7 missed calls from David, 2 missed calls from Pamela, and a string of 5 text messages. She tapped the first message. David, 9:45 a.m. "Mom, the bank manager is waiting. Where are you?" "The receptionist said she saw you walking toward the bus stop at 7 in the morning. Did you go senile? Answer me right now." She tapped the second message. David, 10:02 a.m. "I'm at the bank. The appointment was for 10. I had to reschedule for Tuesday. Pamela is frantic. We went to the house again. The neighbors said they saw you get on the transit bus with Buster. Why are you on a public bus, Mom? What are you doing?" Beatrice stared at the text. She did not feel the rising heat of panic. She did not feel the urge to call him back, to apologize, or to explain her movements. She watched the waitress approach, carrying a heavy white ceramic mug of hot water and a small metal teapot. The steam rose, smelling of dry black tea leaves and hot porcelain. Beatrice slowly laid her phone face down on the table, her hand reaching for the teapot as she prepared to let the leaves steep in the quiet warmth of the diner. The toasted cheese sandwich arrived on a thick, white stoneware plate, its edges slightly chipped from years of commercial dishwashing. The wheat bread was browned in neat diagonal ridges, the sharp cheddar melted into a rich golden glaze that bubbled slightly at the crust. Beatrice picked up half of the sandwich, her fingers registering the dry, warm heat of the toasted grain. She ate slowly, her movements measured and entirely unhurried, chewing each bite thoroughly. The diner around her hummed with the comforting low-frequency clatter of heavy spoons against ceramic mugs, the occasional hiss of steam from the espresso machine behind the counter, and the quiet murmurs of local farmers discussing the afternoon freeze. Under the table, a cold, wet nose nudged the palm of her left hand. Beatrice looked down, her face remaining neutral, though her eyes held a soft, secret warmth. She pinched a small piece of the golden cheddar from the corner of her sandwich, a tiny, savory scrap, and slid her hand beneath the vinyl bench. Buster took it from her fingertips with a gentle, dry-lipped touch, his tail giving a single, muffled thump against the metal floor grate before he settled back onto his paws. She finished her tea, the black leaves having steeped to a dark, bitter amber at the bottom of the pot. She poured the last half cup, added a splash of cold milk from the small ceramic pitcher, and drank it in 3 slow swallows. When Mary returned with the bill, Beatrice reached into her leather coin purse. The total was $6.40. She laid a $10 bill on the table, sliding a 50-cent piece next to it. "Keep the change, Mary," Beatrice said. "Thank you, Beatrice," Mary said, pulling the bill from the laminate. "You take care of yourself on that lane now. The ice is going to be terrible tonight." "I will," Beatrice said. She buttoned her green wool coat, adjusted her scarf, and clipped Buster's red leash back onto his collar. They stepped out of the diner's warm, greasy air back into the quiet, frozen silence of the street. The post office was situated at the far end of the square, a modest brick building with a flagpole that rattled slightly in the north wind. Inside, the lobby was empty, the air smelling of wet cardboard, ink, and the dry, warm scent of paper. The walls were lined with rows of small, brass-faced mailboxes, their glass panels displaying the dark, empty interiors of the compartments behind them. Beatrice walked to the second row. She stopped in front of box 114. She reached into the inner pocket of her green coat, her gloved fingers searching the zipper until they found the small brass key. The metal was cold against her skin. She slid the key into the lock of box 114, turning it with a firm, practiced twist of her wrist. The brass door swung open with a soft, metallic scrape. Inside the small box lay a single, crisp, white envelope. On the front, printed in neat, blue computer type, was her name and her new mailing address. Beatrice Vance, P.O. Box 114, West Oak. In the upper left corner, the logo of the County First Bank was embossed in a pale, clean silver. Beatrice pulled the envelope from the box. She did not open it immediately. She held the thick paper in her hand, feeling the physical weight of her privacy. She turned her back to the main service window, where an elderly clerk was sorting packages, and carefully slid her index finger beneath the sealed paper flap. The glue gave way with a dry, tearing hiss. She unfolded the paper statement for the period ending November 15th. Her eyes moved down the column of black numbers, her mind processing the lines with the quiet precision of her clerical years. November 12th, direct deposit, County Municipal Pension, $2,400. November 15th, branch withdrawal, cash, minus $500. Current balance, $1,900. The ledger was clean. The $500 withdrawal she had made on Monday was recorded precisely, but more importantly, the mailing preference was marked. Mailing address updated to box 114, paper delivery restored. David's phone application would show only the $1,900 balance, but he would never be able to access the transaction code required to see the withdrawal history or the address change. To the digital portal, the account was locked behind the verification number that was currently sitting inside her pocket. Beatrice folded the statement back into 3 neat sections, slid it into her inner coat pocket, and locked the brass door of box 114 with a quiet click. As she stepped back onto the concrete ramp outside the post office, her phone gave a sudden 3-pulse vibration in her pocket. It was a call from Pamela. Beatrice stood under the brick awning, watching the pale gray light of the afternoon fade slowly over the courthouse lawn. She did not answer. She let the phone vibrate until the motor died. Then she took a firm grip of Buster's leash and began the slow, quiet walk back toward the church lane, where the county transit bus would return her to her dark, locked cottage. The county transit bus dropped Beatrice near the village church at exactly 3:15. The blue twilight of the late November afternoon was already beginning to settle over the valley, turning the fog into a heavy frozen mist that clung to the dark branches of the roadside pines. The temperature had dropped to 24 degrees, the north wind carrying a sharp, biting scent of wood smoke and incoming snow from the ridge. Beatrice walked down Oak Lane with a slow, deliberate stride, her gloved hand holding Buster's red leash close to her coat. The old dog walked close to her shins, his breath puffing in tiny, synchronized clouds of white steam that vanished instantly in the freezing air. When they reached her white wooden gate, she stopped. The silver SUV was gone. The gravel driveway was empty, the sharp ruts David's tires had left yesterday now frozen solid, looking like miniature gray mountain ranges of hard clay. No new tire tracks marked the frost on the grass. She walked up the 3 wooden steps of the porch, her boots making a loud, hollow thump in the quiet lane. Tucked firmly between the brass handle of the front door and the wooden frame was a folded sheet of lined notebook paper, its edges damp and limp from the freezing mist. Beatrice did not touch it immediately. She reached into her pocket, retrieved her heavy iron key, lifted the handle by exactly half an inch, and turned the deadbolt. The door opened into the dark, silent hallway. The air inside was freezing, barely 50 degrees, smelling of old lemon polish and cold plaster. "Inside, Buster," she murmured. The dog limped across the threshold, his tail giving a single, tired wag as Beatrice unclipped his leash. He walked straight to the living room and sank onto his wool rug, his bones settling with a long, wet sigh. Beatrice pulled the damp piece of paper from the doorframe, stepped inside, and locked the door behind her, sliding the brass bolt into the strike plate. She walked to the small hallway thermostat, a round, beige plastic dial on the wall. She turned it to 58 degrees. It was a modest setting, just enough to keep the old iron pipes in the cellar from freezing, but low enough to maintain the cool, quiet stillness she preferred. The boiler in the basement kicked in with a low, shuddering hum, the pipes in the walls beginning to give their familiar, rhythmic clink, clink, clink as the hot water began to circulate. She carried her canvas bag to the kitchen, set it on the table, and unfolded the damp note under the yellow glare of the single overhead bulb. The handwriting was David's, a hurried, aggressive script written with a thick blue ballpoint pen that had pressed so hard into the paper it had nearly torn the fibers. "Mom, I don't know what kind of game you are playing. I spent 3 hours driving through the village and calling the local clinics looking for you. The bank manager was furious about the missed appointment. I had to pull 3 strings just to get us a new slot on Tuesday morning at 10. I will be at the cottage at 9:30 on Tuesday. If you are not there, or if you refuse to open the door, I am going to contact the county health officer to request a formal wellness check and an adult protective services evaluation. Living in a house with a failing heating system and no family support is not safe for someone of your age. I am doing this for your own good. Answer your phone." Beatrice read the note twice. Her expression did not soften, and her pulse remained a calm 64 beats per minute. Adult Protective Services Evaluation. She looked at the yellowed linoleum of her kitchen floor, clean and swept of any dried mud. She looked at her pantry, stocked with neat rows of canned broth, tea tins, and oatmeal. David was attempting to use the state's bureaucracy as a lever, believing the threat of a social worker would terrify an elderly woman into submission. But David did not know about Arthur Sterling's yellow legal pad. He did not know that next Friday morning, Dr. Evans would sign a formal clinical affidavit certifying her perfect cognitive clarity, or that by next Friday afternoon, the cottage would no longer belong to her estate. Beatrice picked up the note. She did not crumple it. She walked to the fireplace in the living room, took a single wooden match from the brass box on the mantel, and struck it against the brick. The flame flared, bright and blue, before turning a warm, rich yellow. She touched the flame to the corner of David's note. The paper caught instantly, the blue ink turning black and bubbling as the fire consumed the aggressive handwriting, reducing the threats of wellness checks and Tuesday appointments to a pile of gray, weightless ash in the iron grate. She walked to the dining table. The pink cardboard box of donuts sat exactly where Pamela had left it, the cardboard now thoroughly soaked and smelling of sour lard. Beatrice picked up the box, carried it to the kitchen, and dropped it into the metal trash bin beneath the sink. It hit the bottom with a loud, final clatter. "Come, Buster," Beatrice said, her voice soft in the warm, hum-filled kitchen. "It is 5 o'clock. Time for your supper." The kitchen clock ticked with a heavy plastic rhythm that seemed to measure the slow settling of the cold outside. Beatrice stood by the sink, her gloved hands having been exchanged for her dry, bare ones. She reached into the pantry and pulled out Buster's metal dish. Meticulously, she measured exactly 1 cup of his senior kibble from the large paper bag, the dry pellets rattling against the tin like gravel. She added 3 tablespoons of warm water from the whistling kettle on the stove, stirring the mixture with an old, worn metal spoon until the warm water softened the hard pieces, creating a thin, rich gravy. "There you are, Buster," she murmured, setting the dish on the floorboards beside the pantry. The dog stood over his bowl, his tail giving 2 slow, heavy thumps against the cabinet doors before he began to eat, the soft, rhythmic sound of his chewing filling the quiet kitchen. While Buster ate, Beatrice prepared her own simple supper. She did not require a heavy meal. She filled a small copper pot with a cup of water, placed it on the iron grate of the stove, and turned the dial until the blue gas flame hissed into life. She took a single white egg from the carton in the refrigerator. She waited for the water in the pot to reach a rolling boil, watching the tiny bubbles cling to the copper sides before breaking the surface. Using an old tablespoon, she lowered the egg gently into the bubbling water to prevent the shell from cracking. She turned the glass sand timer on the shelf, a small wooden-framed hourglass filled with fine white sand. It was timed for exactly 4 minutes. She sliced a single piece of stale wheat bread from the loaf, placing it flat on a dry cast-iron skillet on the adjacent burner. She did not use butter. She watched the bread closely, turning it once with a wooden spatula until both sides were crisp, dry, and marked with pale brown scorch lines from the hot iron. When the last grain of white sand slipped through the narrow neck of the timer, Beatrice turned off the gas. She ran the egg under cold tap water, the steam rising from the sink, smelling faintly of rust and hot calcium. She peeled the shell with slow, precise movements, the thin white skin beneath giving way in clean, paper-like sheets until the smooth white egg lay on her stoneware plate next to the dry toast. She sat at the kitchen table, her back straight, her elbows tucked close to her sides. She ate her supper in silence, her eyes fixed on the blank, dark window pane. The wind from the north was growing stronger, making the loose storm window in the dining room rattle with a dry, hollow vibration. The heat from the hallway radiator had begun to reach the kitchen, warming the air to 58 degrees, but she kept her gray wool cardigan buttoned tight to her throat. When she finished, she carried her plate, the small pot, and her spoon to the sink. She washed them immediately, using a tiny drop of green liquid soap and warm water. She dried each item with a clean, frayed tea towel, printed with faded blue cornflowers, placing them back in their exact positions on the shelf. Everything in the kitchen was in its proper place. The counters were bare. The stove was dark. She walked through the quiet living room, Buster limping slowly behind her. She stopped at the front door. She verified the deadbolt, lifting the brass handle slightly to ensure the latch was settled deep into the frame. She walked to the back door off the pantry, checking the heavy iron bolt she had installed herself 3 years ago. Finally, she walked to the dark cellarway door. She opened it, reached into the pocket of her heavy green coat hanging on the peg, and pulled out her black phone. She stood in the dim light of the hallway, using her thumb to unlock the screen. The pale blue light illuminated her face, casting long, sharp shadows across her high cheekbones. There was a single new text message, sent at 6:42 p.m. This one was from Pamela. Pamela, 6:42 p.m. Beatrice, David is completely beside himself. His blood pressure is through the roof. I don't know what you think you're accomplishing by hiding from us, but it's incredibly selfish. We're only trying to help you. If you don't call David back tonight, we're driving over tomorrow morning with the county nurse. We cannot leave you in that freezing house without supervision. Beatrice read the text with a quiet, clinical focus. Selfish. The word had been used against her for 30 years, every time she declined to sign a family loan, every time she refused to let David store his business inventory in her dry cellar, and every time she suggested that a 30-year-old man should pay his own car insurance. To Pamela, her boundaries were a personal offense, a stubborn refusal to let the family consume the small, quiet space she had built with her husband. She did not reply. She did not lock the screen. Instead, she powered the phone down entirely, the blue screen turning black, burying the threats of county nurses and tomorrow morning's visits in the silent plastic casing. She walked to her knitting basket by her high-backed chair. She lifted a thick, heavy skein of dark green wool yarn, placed the dark phone at the very bottom of the wicker basket, and laid the wool back over it, hiding the device beneath the heavy, soft fibers. She sat in her chair, pulled her reading glasses onto her nose, and picked up her book, a thick, green-covered volume on county land registries she had kept from her records office years. The clock on the mantel chimed 8:30. She had 3 days before Tuesday morning, 3 days of cold, silent preparation, and she would spend them exactly as she pleased, undisturbed by the rising panic of the world outside her gate. The first light of Saturday morning was not gray, but a pale, frozen silver that struggled to penetrate the thick hoarfrost coating the window panes. Beatrice woke at exactly 6 o'clock, her eyes opening in the dark to the rhythmic, dry rasp of Buster's breathing at the foot of her bed. The temperature in the bedroom was cool, but the hot water pipes beneath the floorboards gave a steady, warm hum that let her know the old boiler was holding its ground against the 20-degree chill outside. She threw back the wool blankets, her feet finding her heavy leather slippers. She dressed with a quiet, deliberate focus, choosing a clean, high-collared white cotton blouse and her pressed gray wool trousers. She brushed her silver hair back into its neat, tight bun, securing it with 3 heavy tortoiseshell pins she had kept in a porcelain dish on her dresser for 40 years. She did not look like an old woman struggling to manage her own affairs. She looked like a woman who had spent decades managing the county's public registries, neat, orderly, and entirely in possession of her own space. She walked to the kitchen and turned the thermostat dial from 58 to 62 degrees. She prepared a pot of strong black tea, the kettle's low, rising whistle the only sound in the quiet cottage. While the leaves steeped, she took a clean, damp cloth and wiped down the kitchen counters, ensuring the yellowed tiles were immaculate. She swept the floor once more, though there was no dirt to be found, and checked her pantry, aligning the cans of chicken broth and the boxes of oatmeal in neat, forward-facing rows. If a social worker or a county nurse were to step across her threshold today, they would find a home that was warmer, cleaner, and better stocked than the modern, cluttered houses of her neighbors. At 8:15 a.m., Beatrice sat in her high-backed chair by the bay window. She did not have her knitting needles in her hand. Her book lay closed on the side table. She kept her fingers folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the white wooden gate at the end of her driveway. The snow had begun to fall, not in heavy drifts, but in small, dry flakes that swirled through the bare branches of the willow tree. dusting the gravel path with a light, powdery sheet of white. Buster lay beside her boots, his chin resting on his paws, his tail giving a single heavy thump every few minutes, as if keeping time with the grandfather clock in the corner. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The time moved with a slow, heavy cadence. At 8:55 a.m., the quiet of the lane was broken by the low, wet crunch of tires on the frozen gravel. Through the swirled snow of the window pane, Beatrice watched the silver nose of David's SUV slide into view, its tires throwing up small clods of frozen mud as it came to a halt by her gate. Beside it, a second vehicle, a plain dark blue sedan with the county seal stamped in white on the front door, pulled in, parking parallel to the ditch. The engine of the county car died with a soft, wheezing rattle. David's door opened and he stepped out, his face pale and tight beneath his black wool cap. He did not look at the cottage. He walked straight to the passenger side of the blue sedan, opening the door for a tall, middle-aged woman in a dark trench coat who carried a thick leather clipboard under her arm. Pamela emerged from the SUV, her designer winter coat zipped to her chin, her face a mask of performative gravity as she fell into step behind them. Beatrice did not stand up. Her hands remained folded over her gray wool trousers, her face as smooth and unyielding as the limestone steps of her porch. Beside her boots, Buster's ears twitched. He did not growl. He simply lifted his head, his dark eyes fixing on the front door with a quiet, ancient watchfulness that mirrored her own. The three figures walked up the gravel path, their heavy boots making a dry, crunching rhythm on the frozen snow. David took the lead, his jaw set, his hand reaching out to lift the latch of the wooden gate. They climbed the 3 wooden steps of the porch. A second later, the heavy brass knocker on the front door struck the wood with a loud, hollow clatter that echoed through the silent hallway. Thud, thud, thud. Beatrice took a slow, deep breath, her pulse remaining a steady, calm 64 beats per minute. The preparation was finished. The silent war had reached her door, and she was entirely ready to let the machinery of her choices begin to run. The brass knocker struck the wood a second time, the vibrations traveling through the heavy pine panel of the front door and echoing down the narrow hallway. Beatrice rose from her high-backed chair. Her movements were smooth, her spine straight as she walked toward the entryway. Buster followed at her left heel, his uneven steps sounding soft against the polished floorboards. She stopped at the door. Her gloved hands were gone, her bare fingers cool and dry as she reached out. She lifted the heavy brass handle by exactly half an inch, turned the key in the deadbolt, and pulled the door open. A sudden, sharp gust of freezing air rushed into the hallway, carrying a few dry flakes of snow that dissolved instantly on the warm linoleum. David stood on the porch, his face flushed red from the cold, his gloved hands clutching a leather folder to his chest. Behind him, Pamela stood with her arms crossed, her eyes darting past Beatrice into the dark hallway, searching for any sign of neglect. Beside David stood the tall woman in the dark trench coat. She had pale blue eyes, a neat crown of gray hair pinned beneath a wool scarf, and a silver pen held between her gloved fingers, poised over the thick leather clipboard. "Mom," David said, his voice carrying an exaggerated, breathless panic that felt entirely rehearsed. "Thank God, you weren't answering your phone. We've been calling since yesterday afternoon. We were terrified you had fallen or, well, with the freeze, We didn't know if the pipes had burst." "Good morning, David," Beatrice said, her voice quiet, level, and entirely empty of emotion. "Good morning, Pamela." She turned her gaze to the tall woman. "And you must be from the county." "Mrs. Vance," the woman said, her voice professional, low, and carrying the calm, steady cadence of someone who spent her days navigating domestic disputes. "I'm Sarah Halloway from the county's Adult Protective Services Division. Your son contacted our office yesterday evening, expressing some urgent concerns regarding your living conditions and your cognitive wellness." "I see," Beatrice said. She did not flinch. She did not look at David with anger or betrayal. She stepped back, holding the door wide, her hand resting lightly on the brass frame. "Please, step inside out of the damp. It is much too cold to discuss legal matters on the porch." Ms. Halloway stepped across the threshold first, her heavy winter boots clicking softly on the clean, yellowed linoleum. She stopped in the entryway, her eyes immediately scanning the narrow space. She did not find the dark, stagnant chill David had described on the phone. The air inside the hallway was 70 degrees, the warm, circulating heat of the hot water radiators filling the small space with a dry, comfortable warmth. The scent in the air was clean, holding only the faint, sweet trace of lemon wax and the dry, smoky smell of the fireplace. "Oh, Beatrice, darling," Pamela cooed, stepping in behind Ms. Halloway, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she reached out to pat Beatrice's sleeve. "We were just so worried. The house was so cold when we left on Thursday, and we know how stubborn you can be about turning up the heat. We just wanted to make sure you had everything you needed." Beatrice stepped back, avoiding Pamela's touch with a slow, polite sidestep as she closed the front door, the deadbolt clicking home behind them. "I have everything I require, Pamela," Beatrice said. She gestured toward the living room. "Please, sit. Miss Halloway, you may use the dining table if you need to write. It is quite clear." Miss Halloway walked into the living room, her eyes systematically registering the details of the room. She noted the pristine condition of the floral wallpaper, which had no water stains or peeling edges. She noted the small wicker basket near the mantel, which held only neat, folded grocery circulars, no overdue notices or red-stamped warnings. She looked at the fireplace, where a neat mound of gray, weightless ash sat in the iron grate, completely clean of clutter. Finally, she looked down at Buster. The old terrier had sat down on his Persian rug, his chin resting on his paws, his dark eyes watching Ms. Halloway with a calm, silent intelligence. He did not growl. He did not bark. He looked like an animal that had been loved and cared for every day of his life. "Your son indicated that the heating system in this house was failing, Mrs. Vance," Ms. Halloway said, her pen hovering over the clipboard as she looked at the brass radiator in the corner, which was currently giving a soft, rhythmic clink-clink as the hot water circulated. "The boiler was serviced on the 12th of October, Ms. Halloway," Beatrice said, her voice smooth and matter-of-fact. "I have the receipt from the municipal gas company in my desk drawer. The pipes are entirely sound." David's jaw tightened, his face turning a darker shade of red as he stepped into the center of the living room, his leather folder clutched so tightly his knuckles went white. "The house is warm now, Ms. Halloway," David said, his tone sharp with an irritation he was struggling to conceal under his mask of concern. "But she keeps the thermostat turned down to 50 degrees most days to save pennies on the pension. It's not safe. She's 74, and she's been wandering. She got on a public transit bus yesterday morning at 7 and vanished for 6 hours. She wouldn't answer her phone. We had to cancel her medical and bank appointments because we couldn't find her." Miss Halloway looked at David, her eyebrows lifting slightly behind her reading glasses. The dramatic, urgent panic he had expressed on the phone yesterday The picture of an elderly, neglected woman freezing in a dark house was clashing sharply with the clean, warm, and meticulously organized cottage she was standing in. "Is that correct, Mrs. Vance?" Miss Halloway asked, her tone remaining gentle but observant. "Did you travel to West Oak yesterday?" "I did," Beatrice said. She walked to the small mahogany side table, picked up her white ceramic mug, and held it in both hands. "I had some errands to run. I visited the local post office to collect my mail, and I had a consultation regarding some private affairs. My legs are stiff, but I am entirely capable of walking to the bus stop." "She's hiding things, Ms. Halloway," David interjected, his voice rising by half an octave as he took a step toward his mother. "She withdrew $500 in cash on Monday without telling me. She's modified her bank settings so I can't monitor her transactions. I'm her son. I'm the one who handles her affairs. If she's giving her pension away to phone solicitors or if she's losing her cognitive clarity, we need to know. We need to have a joint signature on that account to protect her." Beatrice looked at her son. Her face held no anger, no hurt, and no surprise. She simply stood by her chair, her white blouse crisp, her silver hair neat, her eyes clear and unbothered as she watched him unravel in front of the county representative. Sarah Halloway raised her hand, her silver pen pointing toward David with a gentle but unyielding authority. "Mr. Vance, please," Ms. Halloway said, her voice dropping into a firm, quiet register that instantly filled the warm living room. "I need to conduct this portion of the evaluation with your mother directly. If you continue to interrupt, I will have to ask you and your wife to wait on the porch while I complete the interview." David's mouth opened slightly as if he were about to protest, but the sharp, professional coldness in Ms. Halloway's eyes made him stop. He took a slow, heavy step backward, his leather shoes clicking against the floorboards as he sank onto the edge of the sofa next to Pamela. Pamela did not look at Beatrice now. She sat with her knees pressed tightly together, her hands clutching her tan designer handbag in her lap, her eyes fixed on the silver pen in Ms. Halloway's hand. Ms. Halloway turned back to Beatrice, her expression softening by a fraction of an inch as she sat at the small mahogany dining table. She adjusted her reading glasses. "Mrs. Vance," Ms. Halloway said, her tone carrying a gentle, rhythmic cadence, "I need to ask you a few standard questions. They are quite simple, but they help us establish a baseline of cognitive wellness. Do you mind?" "I do not mind, Ms. Halloway," Beatrice said. She sat in her high-backed chair, her spine straight, her hands resting flat on her knees. "Can you tell me today's date, including the day of the week?" "Today is Saturday, November 23rd, Beatrice said, her voice clear, steady, and entirely free of hesitation. "The time is currently 9:22 in the morning." Ms. Halloway made a quick, neat notation on her clipboard. "And who is the current president?" "President Joseph Biden," Beatrice said. Ms. Halloway nodded, her pen scratching against the paper. "Can you tell me your address, including the zip code?" 142 Oak Lane, West Oak, 19402, Beatrice said. "I have lived in this house for 41 years. The property deed is registered under Volume 12, page 46 of the County Land Book." David let out a sharp, wet breath from the sofa, his fingers twitching against his leather folder, but he did not speak. Miss Halloway's pen paused. She looked up over her glasses, a look of mild professional surprise passing over her face at the precision of the answer. "That is very specific, Mrs. Vance," Miss Halloway murmured, her voice carrying a faint trace of approval. "Now, your son has expressed some concern regarding your ability to manage your monthly budget. Can you tell me the exact amount of your monthly pension and how you manage your recurring utility bills?" Beatrice took a slow, deep breath, her fingers smoothing the fabric of her gray trousers. "My municipal pension is exactly $2,400, Beatrice said, her voice carrying the smooth, dry authority of her record office years. "It is deposited automatically on the third Thursday of every month. My recurring expenses are quite standard. My water bill is typically $42.10. My electric and gas bill is $168.42. I paid my pharmacy copay of $45 in cash on the 10th of this month." She reached into the inner pocket of her green coat, which she had laid over the back of her chair. Her fingers found the neat white receipt envelope. She pulled it out and laid it flat on the mahogany table. "I keep my receipts here," Beatrice said. "If you wish to examine them, they are entirely current." Miss Halloway took the envelope. She opened it with dry, precise fingers, pulling out the small slips of paper. She did not find the messy, chaotic piles of an aging mind. She found the printed pharmacy receipt for $45. She found the gas bill confirmation, and she found 2 new, clean slips of white paper. The first was a carbon receipt from the office of Arthur Sterling, attorney at law, for $150, marked "Initial consultation and draft preparation for Vance Estate." The second was a receipt from the County Humane Society and Animal Rescue, stamped with a green ink seal, for a $200 cash donation to the Winter Heating Fund. David's head snapped up. He stared at the white slips in Ms. Halloway's hands, his face turning from a dark, flushed red to a sickly, grayish white. What is that?" David stammered, his voice losing its executive authority, cracking with a sudden sharp panic as he stood up from the sofa. "Mom, who is Arthur Sterling? Why were you at a lawyer's office? And what is that donation receipt?" Pamela's hands tightened on her handbag until the gold metal of the clasp pressed into her skin. Her mouth twisted into a thin, bitter line, her eyes wide as she looked at Beatrice. Ms. Halloway did not look at David. She carefully folded the receipts, slid them back into the white envelope, and handed it back to Beatrice. She made 3 heavy, final notations on her clipboard with a sharp, decisive click of her pen. "Mr. Vance," Ms. Halloway said, standing up and buttoning her dark trench coat. Her voice was entirely cold, carrying the flat, administrative authority of her county position. "Your mother has demonstrated perfect cognitive recall, immaculate financial record-keeping, and her home is warm, safe, and exceptionally well-maintained. There is absolutely no basis for a protective services intervention, a wellness check, or an adult protective services evaluation." She turned her gaze to David, her eyes narrowing behind her glasses. "And I must be very clear with you," Ms. Halloway added, her voice dropping into a quiet, warning register. "Using our division to pressure an elderly parent who is entirely sound of mind is a serious matter. If you contact our office again under false pretenses, I will file a formal harassment report with the county sheriff's liaison. Good day, Mr. Vance." She turned to Beatrice, offering a small, polite nod of her head. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Vance. Your dog is very well behaved." "Thank you, Miss Halloway," Beatrice said quietly. "Keep warm on the lane." Miss Halloway walked to the entryway, her heavy boots clicking on the linoleum as she opened the front door, stepping out into the gray, swirling snow of the morning. The door handle lifted and turned, closing with a heavy, final click, leaving the 3 of them standing in the sudden, suffocating silence of the cottage. The door had barely settled back into its frame before the silence in the cottage fractured. David turned on his heel, his face no longer gray, but a dark, congested purple that made the veins at his temples stand out like thick blue cords. He threw his leather folder onto the coffee table, the heavy corner striking the edge of the stoneware mug Beatrice had left there, sending a sharp ceramic clink through the room. "Arthur Sterling?" David's voice was no longer a rehearsed whisper. It was a harsh, scraping shout that made the old mahogany clock on the mantelpiece vibrate. "You went to Arthur Sterling, the estate attorney? What did you sign, Mom? What did you do with the deed to this house?" Beatrice did not rise. She sat in her high-backed chair, her hands remaining folded in her lap, her eyes cool and unblinking as she watched the sheer, raw panic of his greed unravel. "Beatrice, answer him!" Pamela snapped. The soft, cooing mask of the devoted daughter-in-law had completely vanished, leaving her face looking thin, sharp, and ugly under the yellow light of the floor lamp. She took 3 rapid steps toward Beatrice's chair, her plum-colored nails digging into the leather of her own handbag. "We have spent years coming out here every single month. We brought you food. We made sure you had everything you needed. And you're bypassing your own son? You're giving this house to some animal shelter? Have you completely lost your mind?" "I have not lost my mind, Pamela," Beatrice said, her voice smooth, level, and entirely devoid of the defensiveness they were trying to provoke. "I am simply making a secure arrangement for the future." "The future?" David roared. He walked into the entryway, his boots dragging the wet snow across the floorboards. He reached out and snatched Beatrice's black leather handbag from the brass peg beside the door. "Is it in here? The bank book? The keys?" He did not wait for her to answer. With a violent, tearing motion, he pulled the main zipper open. He turned the bag upside down, dumping its contents onto the yellowed linoleum of the hallway floor. A small plastic pack of tissues, a silver magnifying glass, a ring of old keys, and $3 bills with 50 cents in silver rolled across the floorboards. No blue bankbook, no white envelope of cash, no deed. David kicked the empty handbag aside, his chest heaving under his heavy wool coat. He turned back to the living room, his eyes wild as they scanned the small space, the sewing basket, the mahogany side table, the desk drawers. "Where is it?" David demanded, taking an aggressive step toward her chair, his shadow falling completely over her small, woolen-clad frame. "Where did you hide the bank book, Mom? I am your next of kin. I have a legal right to see your financial records. You're 74. You can't just throw away $200,000 of family equity because you're having a stubborn spell." Beside Beatrice's boots, Buster stood up. The old terrier's legs were stiff, his joints clicking as he rose, but the gray fur along his spine was completely raised. He stepped in front of Beatrice's shins, his head lowered, his white muzzled jaw parted to reveal his small, worn teeth. A deep, wet growl rumbled from the very back of his throat, a sound of ancient, absolute warning that vibrated through the floorboards. "Get that stupid dog away from me!" David screamed, his arms swinging out in a sudden, violent gesture of frustration. He raised his heavy leather boot as if he were about to kick the old terrier aside. "I swear to God, Mom, if you don't give me the keys to the account right now, I'll—" "David," Beatrice stood up. She did not shout. She did not raise her voice by even a single decibel. But the sheer, cold authority in her tone was so sharp, so absolute, that David's boot froze in midair, his arm hovering uselessly in the space between them. She stood with her shoulders back, her silver hair neat under her pins, her eyes holding his with a razor-like focus that had spent 34 years documenting the legal rise and fall of families in the county records. "You will not touch my dog," Beatrice said, her voice dropping into a quiet, icy whisper that made the heat in the room feel as though it had suddenly died. "And you will not touch another item in this house." David slowly lowered his boot, his face twisting into a mask of bitter, impotent rage. He took a half-step back, his breathing ragged and wet in the quiet room. "You have 24 hours to remove your things from my driveway, David," Beatrice said, her hand reaching into her coat pocket to touch the cold, hard edges of the brass key to box 114. "The door is behind you. If you or Pamela step onto this porch again, I will not call the social worker. I will call the sheriff." Ms. Holloway's warning was quite specific, and I have the number of Arthur Sterling's office programmed into my phone. Pamela backed toward the entryway, her plum-colored nails trembling as she reached for her coat collar. She looked at the dumped contents of Beatrice's purse on the floor, then at the old dog, who was still growling, his teeth bare in the dim light. "Let's go, David," Pamela whispered, her voice tight with a sudden, genuine fear. She's completely crazy. Let the lawyers handle it. We're not getting anything out of her today." David stared at his mother, his jaw working as he tried to find some final, bitter words to throw at her. But as he looked into her clear, unbothered eyes, he realized that the comfortable safety net he had relied on to fund his shipping debts was gone. The line had been crossed, the trap had been sprung, and he was standing on the outside. He snatched his leather folder from the coffee table, turned, and walked out of the cottage, his heavy boots crushing the small plastic pack of tissues on the floor as he left. The front door lifted, turned, and slammed shut behind them, with a violent, wood-shattering bang that made the copper pots in the kitchen rattle. Beatrice stood perfectly still in the center of her living room, the silence rushing back to fill the empty space like cold water. She looked down at the floor, where her magnifying glass lay glinting in the pale silver light of the window. She did not tremble. She did not cry. She reached down, her dry, steady hand stroking the rough, gray fur of Buster's back until the old dog's growl subsided into a long, quiet sigh. The heavy metallic roar of the silver SUV's engine started up in the driveway, the sound sharp and violent in the frozen morning air. Beatrice stood by the bay window, watching through the swirled frost as the vehicle backed out of the gate with a sudden, reckless jerk. The tires spun, spraying a shower of frozen yellow clay and gravel against the wooden fence posts before David slammed the transmission into drive and sped down the lane, the red taillights vanishing almost instantly into the thick, swirling snow. The silence of the cottage rushed back, deep, heavy, and completely undisturbed. Beatrice did not move for several minutes. She kept her eyes fixed on the empty gate, watching the dry flakes of snow begin to settle over the fresh, deep ruts David's tires had carved into the lane. The wind had shifted slightly, blowing from the east now, carrying a soft, whispering sound as the snow brushed against the glass pane. At her feet, Buster let out a long, wet sigh, his shoulders relaxing as he slowly sank back onto his haunches. He gave his chest a quick, thorough lick, his rough, pink tongue making a soft, scraping sound in the quiet room, before he laid his chin back onto his paws. "Good boy," Beatrice murmured, her hand reaching down to stroke the soft, gray fur behind his ears. She walked slowly into the entryway. The floorboards were cold beneath her slippers. She looked down at the linoleum, where the contents of her black leather handbag lay scattered across the floor. David's heavy leather boot had left a dark, wet smear of melted snow and yellow clay across the small plastic pack of tissues, crushing the paper inside. Beatrice knelt down, her knees giving a soft, dry click in the quiet hallway. Her movements were unhurried, steady, and entirely methodical. She picked up the silver magnifying glass first, She held it up to the pale light of the hallway lamp, checking the glass for any scratches or cracks. Finding none, she used the hem of her gray cardigan to wipe a tiny speck of dust from the lens before placing it carefully on her lap. Next, she gathered the small black pocket comb. She aligned the thin plastic teeth, ensuring they were clean, and set it beside the magnifying glass. She picked up the 3 folded dollar bills and the 50 cents in silver. The coins were cold, clinking softly in her palm as she counted them. 2 quarters, both worn smooth at the edges from decades of circulation. She folded the paper bills precisely into quarters, matching the edges exactly. She picked up her ring of old brass cabinet keys. They were small, delicate keys that belonged to the roll-top desk in the corner and the cedar chest in her bedroom. Keys David had never been allowed to touch. Finally, she picked up the crushed pack of tissues. She smoothed the plastic wrapper, wiping away the wet clay with a corner of her clean handkerchief until the package was white and neat once more. She stood up, her joints protesting slightly, but her spine remained straight. She retrieved the black leather handbag from where David had kicked it near the umbrella stand. She shook it once to clear any loose dust, then placed each item back inside the main compartment, one by one. The tissues, the magnifying glass, the comb, the folded bills, the silver coins, and the brass keys. She pulled the zipper closed, the metal teeth locking together with a clean, continuous slide. She hung the bag back on the brass peg beside the door. It hung straight, a neat, quiet object against the pine paneling, completely empty of her financial secrets. She walked to the kitchen, retrieved the straw broom, and swept the small amount of melted snow and clay David had dragged in, brushing the dirt into her dustpan with a single, practiced stroke. She emptied the pan into the metal bin beneath the sink. "Come, Buster," she said, her voice soft and even. She filled the copper kettle with fresh, cold water from the tap. She set it on the iron grate of the stove, turned the dial, and watched the blue gas flame hiss into life, wrapping the metal base in a warm, steady ring of light. While the water heated, she walked to her knitting basket by her high-backed chair. She looked down at the thick, heavy skein of dark green wool yarn. Deep beneath the soft green fibers, her black phone lay completely silent, powered down and dark, buried where no one would ever think to look. She did not reach for it. She had no desire to check for missed calls or read any further text messages from Pamela. The family's frantic, desperate panic was no longer her concern. The boundary had been set, the legal machinery was moving, and her quiet spaces were entirely secure. She sat in her chair, pulled her reading glasses onto her nose, and opened her green-covered volume on county land registries, the pages rustling softly in the warm room as she began to read. The snow fell with a quiet, continuous density by midday, transforming the lane into a silent, featureless expanse of white. Beatrice stood at the kitchen stove, her hand resting on the warm handle of the small copper pot. The water inside had reached a gentle simmer, the steam rising to fog the window above the sink, obscuring the high brick wall of the coal yard. She dropped a single cube of chicken bouillon into the water, watching it dissolve into a rich, golden broth that smelled of celery, salt, and dried parsley. She poured the steaming broth into her favorite white ceramic mug, the one with the faded gold rim her sister had given her 30 years ago. She carried the mug and a small plate with 2 dry soda crackers into the living room. The room was 65 degrees now, the radiators emitting a steady, comforting warmth that kept the damp chill of the storm completely at bay. She sat in her high-backed chair, her knees tucked beneath her gray wool cardigan, her boots resting on the thick edge of the Persian rug. Through the window, the world was being systematically washed clean. The white flakes swirled in the wind, settling over the gravel path, the wooden gate, and the deep, ugly ruts David's SUV had torn into the clay. Within an hour, the sharp ruts were rounded, softened by the snow, until they disappeared entirely beneath a thick, pristine blanket of white. The lane was empty. The gate was quiet. Buster lay by the hearth, his old body pressed close to the radiating heat of the gas fire. His breathing was a slow, steady rasp, his white-muzzled jaw resting comfortably on his paws. He was warm. He was safe. He would never have to walk on a slippery, cold floor or cower from an angry voice again. Beatrice took a slow, deliberate sip of her hot broth. The salt and warmth settled in her chest, a clean, simple comfort that cleared the last traces of the morning's tension from her shoulders. She did not feel a single tremor of guilt. She did not feel the cold weight of regret. She looked at her copy of the preliminary Lifetime Sanctuary Covenant resting on the side table, its blue cover sheet clean and uncreased. She thought of David's purple, panicked face and Pamela's sharp, bitter words. They had spent years projecting a theater of love and concern, but it had been a hollow performance, designed only to keep her compliant until her pension day arrived, and to ensure her estate would eventually fund their debts. They had built their own structure, brick by brick, out of greed and transactional affection, and she had simply stepped out of the way before the roof fell in. She reached into her coat pocket, her fingers brushing the cool, smooth surface of the brass key to box 114. On Monday morning, the bank would remain locked to David's digital inquiries. On Tuesday morning, he would stand at the bank downtown in his expensive coat, realizing that the county health department would not save him and that his mother's signature was no longer his to command. And next Friday, Beatrice would take the blue and white county bus back to West Oak. She would sit in Mr. Sterling's warm, leather-scented office, and she would sign the final deed transfer in the presence of 2 witnesses, locking the cottage and her pension into a fortress of absolute charity. Beatrice set her mug down on the table with a soft, ceramic clink. She leaned her head back against the deep leather of her chair. She did not turn on the television. She did not reach for her phone. She simply sat in the warm, quiet room, listening to the soft, rhythmic ticking of the mahogany clock on the mantel and the gentle whisper of the snow against the window pane. Her boundaries were complete. Her quiet space was protected, and the silence inside her was entirely her own. The snow continued to fall, wrapping the old cottage in a soft, impenetrable shroud of white. As Beatrice sat in her quiet chair, she looked down at the receipt from Arthur Sterling's office once more. David had assumed she went to the lawyer for the first time on Friday. He had assumed they had until Tuesday's rescheduled bank appointment to find a way to intervene. He had assumed he still had time. But David had spent his entire life underestimating the quiet woman who had spent 34 years processing the county's legal deeds. The security upgrade Beatrice had requested at the bank on Monday morning was never a simple password change. It was the final, prearranged trigger for an irrevocable living trust that she and Arthur Sterling had quietly drafted weeks ago. The moment David tried to bypass her mobile authentication on Thursday, the system flagged the unauthorized attempt and automatically executed the deed transfer. The cottage on Oak Lane was no longer Beatrice's personal property. It already belonged to the West Oak Humane Society, with Beatrice holding an unassailable, legally binding lifetime tenancy. When David arrived at the bank on Tuesday, he wouldn't just find a locked account. He would be met by a team of estate attorneys, presenting him with a legal wall that had been built, brick by brick, while he was busy counting her pension days. Beside her, Buster let out a soft, contented sigh, his warm breath rising in the quiet room. Beatrice took a slow, final sip of her tea, letting the profound, hard-won silence settle around her like a shield. If you found solace in Beatrice's quiet triumph and the meticulous, slow-burn way she reclaimed her independence, we invite you to subscribe to the channel. By turning on notifications, you ensure you never miss our next deep dive into the complex, silent battles of human nature. Your support is what allows us to continue crafting these detailed, deeply satisfying stories of resilience, justice, and quiet strength. Thank you for listening, and until next time, remember to protect the quiet sanctuaries of your own life.